Reagan's point man on Central America, Assistant Secretary of State Elliott Abrams, and Presidential Envoy to the region Philip Habib flew to Miami, where they held a private day-long meeting along with a Costa Rican high-ranking government official. Costa Rica's President Oscar Arias, seen here in a recent meeting at the White House, along with Guatemala, are proposing a peace initiative to end the Nicaraguan rebel war in the region. Costa Rica, on Nicaragua's southern border, is a home to Contra camps from which attacks are launched against the Sandinistas. Earlier today at a United Nicaraguan Opposition news conference, Contra leader Adolfo Calero said UNO does not object to the peace initiative, but he has serious reservations about what the plan must include.
If there is to be any solution of the Nicaraguan crisis and the Central American crisis, then both parties of the Nicaraguan crisis must be taken into consideration.
The meeting ended without State Department officials or the Costa Rican foreign minister making any comment. Both Elliott Abrams and Philip Habib are back in Washington. Given the fact that a similar peace plan offered by the Guatemalan government exactly a year ago failed, it's highly unlikely this one has much of a chance, since the Reagan administration and Contra leaders are adamant about accepting any compromise, leaving the leftist Sandinista regime in power. At Miami International Airport, Susan Candiotti, Channel 10 Eyewitness News on the Night Beat. Eyewitness News has talked to two of these men, both now in prison. As incredible as it may sound, they claim that drugs for guns exchanges to help the Contras have been going on for at least 3 years, with the approval of the U.S. government, including the CIA and DEA. Eyewitness News has learned that a counsel to the Congressional Subcommittee on Crime, Hayden Gregory, interviewed a convicted drug smuggler Friday at a federal prison in Southwest Dade. He is Gary Betzner, a former crop duster who admittedly has been on the wrong side of the law for years, piloting drugs into Florida. Betzner told Eyewitness News about 3 drugs for guns trips in 1983 and 84. One was in the spring of 1983, smuggling 6,000 pounds of marijuana. Betzner says he flew a C-47 provided by now-deceased DEA defendant informant Barry Seal. The plane was loaded with 1,200 to 1,500 pounds of explosive mines. The flight originated in the Florida Keys, landing first at Ilopango Airport in El Salvador, where the mines were offloaded. Betzner says he then flew on to Rio Hacho, Colombia, where he picked up 3 tons of marijuana. Then flew back to Great Harbor Key in the Bahamas. On a second trip in July 1984, Betzner claims he flew 500 kilos of cocaine to South Florida aboard a Piper Navajo. This trip from Fort Lauderdale to Costa Rica to a clandestine strip in Central Florida. On the way down, he says he carried a ton of weapons and explosives. On the way back, he brought coke. 1 month later, Betzner claims another drugs for guns mission. He says he took a Cessna Titan from Opa-locka Airport to Costa Rica and back to Opa-locka, bringing back another 500 keys of coke. He says he was paid $350,000 for each of the last 2 trips. Betzner claims that both the CIA and DEA have deserted him.
Dozens of people were recruited into this program with offers of protection from arrest, discounted drugs, and even blackmail. Getting out of this program is harder than retiring from the mafia.
Betzner claims he also flew some of those alleged CIA-backed missions for George Morales.
The CIA asked me, the Contra leader asked me to do it, and I did it. And they have proof, and I have proof of it.
Morales is an alleged drug kingpin currently in prison awaiting trial. The champion speedboat racer has told investigators he provided planes for the flights, allegedly assisted by DEA, but questions who profited from the drugs, claiming he did not.
There's nothing wrong with the Contras. What is wrong is the people, the leaders, some of them, who are getting wealthy, who are getting profit of the situation.
However, DEA categorically denies it has ever helped Morales or any other drug smuggler.
We do not condone the importation of cocaine for transshipment of arms anywhere, anytime, anyhow. Knowing George Morales and knowing the fact that he's facing 2 10-to-life sentences, it doesn't surprise me Morales would say anything to get himself out of the jam he's in. 2
main questions remain unanswered. First, how credible is the word of convicted and alleged drug smugglers who want immunity for their stories and out of jail? Secondly, where did all the alleged drug profits go? Contra leaders in Miami disavow any knowledge of these men. Nor, they add, do they condone smuggling drugs for guns. In Miami, Susan Candiotti, Channel 10 Eyewitness News. It comes as no surprise, given all the investigations into the Iran-Contra affair, that Contra leaders want to put their best foot forward. Today, the United Nicaraguan Opposition, which runs the Contra movement, took the first step by announcing an overhaul of all money on hand or coming in. Most importantly, UNO has announced that come April 21st, a complete global account of every source of financial aid to its cause must be documented by UNO's Secretary General. Furthermore, UNO's 3-member directorate from now on will control and centralize all fundraising from public and private sources. It will directly handle all dealings with foreign governments to solicit aid and renew efforts to create a Nicaraguan American Foundation. The actions mean that FDN Army Director Adolfo Calero is now excluded from handling any proceeds from fundraising efforts. Calero, who resigned from UNO under pressure from the State Department, appeared today before a federal grand jury in Washington. He is the first major Contra witness to testify before Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh investigating the Iran-Contra scandal. The man who took Calero's place is Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, UNO's former press secretary. In an exclusive interview with Eyewitness News, he said, quote, "I hope to bring about certain reforms that would not destroy what is working. That is, that the medicine doesn't kill the patient." He also wants to revive relations with Miami's Nicaraguan exile community and widen UNO's assembly. UNO leaders will meet in Costa Rica this weekend to talk about reform. Expanding UNO's board of directors is still a few months away, and while it might bring Adolfo Calero back into the directorate, it might also spark more resignations at a time when the U.S. Congress is looking for signs of unity before approving any more aid to the Contras. In Miami, Susan Candiotti, Channel 10 Eyewitness News. This time, they only had him in custody 5 weeks before he walked out of prison.
It's unbelievable to us also, Susan. I don't know how it can happen again. It's probably the same old story. Somebody's been paid.
A Colombian judge ordering the release of reputed drug lord Jorge Ochoa, his Medellin cartel believed responsible for 80% of all cocaine smuggled into the U.S. Calling Ochoa's release order completely unprecedented and suspicious, Colombian authorities say it is legal. The Medellin judge who signed the document will be investigated, and roadblocks are up in what many observers consider a near futile attempt to recapture Ochoa. DEA is furious.
It takes people of integrity and courage, to punish him and to keep him locked up or to turn him over to us so we can do so.
Ochoa, you'll recall, is wanted on a federal indictment in Miami, charging him with massive drug importation, including a load through Nicaragua. He's also believed linked to the murder of DEA informant Barry Seal. So far, extradition attempts have failed. Today, the State Department called in the Colombian ambassador to protest Ochoa's latest slip from authorities.
We are disgusted by the fact that this major Colombian narcotics trafficker is now free. The government of Colombia had a clear responsibility to make certain this dangerous criminal was not released.
Meantime, DEA Miami reports record-breaking seizures in the last quarter of 1987. More than 11 tons of drugs and $133 million in assets confiscated. But with the street price of coke as low as it's ever been, there's still plenty coming in. Add to that Ochoa's release, and you've got growing frustration in the war against drugs. In Miami, Susan Candiotti, Channel 10 Eyewitness News. This time he says he really means it. Arturo Cruz resigning from the Contra's umbrella organization, United Nicaraguan Opposition. His on-again, off-again threatened resignation comes on the heels of a threat from Costa Rican President Oscar Arias. After learning UNO was planning to move its headquarters to Costa Rica, Arias told UNO's leaders they are no longer welcome to live or work there in exile. His decision also followed UNO's announcement in Miami last week that it would now control all military as well as political fundraising for the Contras. At that same meeting, Cruz didn't hide his irritation when asked about a plan that would lead to the widening of UNO's directorate.
I have my own views, but I'll make that public in due course.
That restructuring plan would very likely bring the Contra's top military commander, Adolfo Calero, back into UNO's power base. Calero, who has long been at odds with Cruz, resigned last month under pressure from the State Department. A political victory for Cruz's more popular moderate following in Congress. It's Senator Christopher Dodd, who favors cutting future aid to the rebels, says he's not surprised by Cruz's departure.
And obviously he's discovered what many of us have known for some time, and that is the Contra movement is really not a democratic movement. And I feel bad for him because he is sort of left in limbo. Obviously the Sandinistas aren't Democrats either.
On the other hand, the attitude of Nicaraguan exile spokesman Roberto Arguello reflects the apathy of most Miami exiles towards UNO's leadership in general.
I think if he wants to get out, fine.
Both Calero and Cruz's resignations further jeopardize approval of next year's $105 million Contra aid package. UNO's political infighting again casting an unflattering light on an already controversial war. In Miami, Susan Candiotti, Channel 10 Eyewitness News. Tonight, more revelations about Southern Air Transport and its alleged role in illegal arms shipments to the Contras. U.S. Customs Commissioner William Von Raab confirms that a National Security Council official tried to help Southern Air after Customs had launched an investigation. Von Raab said Customs was approached by an NSC official.
This individual indicated that we were after good guys, and why didn't we stop harassing good guys? And
Von Raab denies that the NSC's interference slowed down the investigation. Commissioner Von Raab says Customs is still investigating Southern Air Transport's alleged role in the Contra supply network. He says he will be turning over his investigation to Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh in the next few days. Customs Commissioner Von Raab adds his agency is also moving forward with other investigations into a secret South Florida Contra supply network. We first told you about it in a series of I-Team reports, including a March 1985 arms shipment from Fort Lauderdale International Airport to Ilopango Air Force Base in El Salvador. Participants claim the arms were sent on to the Contra's southern front in Costa Rica.
we're continuing to investigate it. We are making progress, and you'll have to just watch the developments coming out of the grand jury.
Von Raab contends private gun shipments are difficult to stop.
We do not control exports the way we do imports. In other words, smuggling out of the country is much easier to do.
Von Raab made his comments during a private interview at the Customs Air Support Branch at Homestead Air Force Base. The commissioner in South Florida for the one-year anniversary of Operation Blue Lightning, a drug interdiction program involving the cooperation of the Bahamas and local law enforcement agencies throughout Florida. At Homestead Air Force Base, Susan Candiotti, Channel 10 Eyewitness News. The Charlotte County Sheriff's Department on Florida's west coast has apparently stumbled on a Contra supply operation suspected of illegal gun running and possible drug smuggling. This is the cargo plane that tipped them off, a DC-4 owned and piloted by Frank Moss. Seized after local authorities and DEA traced its tail number to Skymaster Corporation of Miami, a shell company dissolved nearly 7 years ago. Skymaster's registered agent, Miami attorney Wallace Garrick, is currently indicted and awaiting trial for allegedly setting up dummy corporations used by drug smugglers. This DC-4 is part of that same 1985 indictment. On board, investigators found all kinds of documents linking Frank Moss to the Contras, including an address book listing Contra leader Adolfo Calero and the head of the Contras Air Force. Also found papers linking another Moss-owned DC-4 to the Contras, a March 1985 cargo manifest. It outlines a shipment from New Orleans to Tegucigalpa, Honduras. On board, Adolfo Calero's brother Mario, Frank Moss, and another pilot. Also seized, a February 1985 U.S. export declaration from Miami International Airport to Tegucigalpa. It lists 6,000 pounds of gun magazines, along with M2 tripods, spare parts, and a tent. The shipper is R&M Equipment of Miami, located at the Tamiami Gun Shop. Owner Jim McCoy acknowledges the shipment, but says it was headed for the Honduran armed forces, not the Contras. However, Eyewitness News has learned of Moss's additional ties to the Contras. He owned Atlas Aviation, a cargo and maintenance operation used by the Contras in Honduras. Moss denies he's done anything wrong. Customs and DEA aren't so sure. They're both investigating, as well as the State Department and Senate Select Committee on the Iran-Contra affair. With an I-Team report, Susan Candiotti, Channel 10 Eyewitness News. Convicted drug smuggler Mike Toliver, who's been doing time at the federal prison in South Dade, says he flew 2 Guns for Drugs missions in 1986. Missions we first told you about last February in a series of exclusive Eyewitness News reports. Toliver's flights took guns to the Contras based in Honduras and returned with plane loads of drugs into South Florida, in one case landing at Homestead Air Force Base. Toliver says he conducted the missions following directives of contacts who have ties to the CIA. They took place at a time when U.S. military aid to the Contras was banned by Congress and therefore illegal.
We leave from a designated place, take down X number of guns or ammunition, but on the way back, we've got full sanction to do whatever we want to.
On his first Guns for Drugs mission in March of last year, Toliver says he took this DC-6 from Miami International Airport. It was loaded with crates containing guns and ammunition.
They had a red cross on the package, like they were medical supplies.
He flew from Miami to Aguacate, a clandestine airstrip used by the Contras in Honduras. There, the shipment is unloaded by people wearing military uniforms. One of them, American Sam Hall, released earlier this year after caught spying on a Nicaraguan Air Force base. Toliver then flies the empty cargo plane to Tegucigalpa, where he stays at a local hotel. A few days later, he returns to the plane and finds that it's been loaded with 25 tons of marijuana. He takes off for South Florida, and while en route, is ordered to land at Homestead Air Force Base.
We were told when they called us on the 20-meter radio to be there at a certain time. They, pretty well figured out ground speed and things like that, and to just go ahead and enter the pattern, and land.
Toliver says he was met by a blue pickup truck that had a "Follow Me" sign on it, and by a man wearing fatigues. He was driven to the gate and left the base in a taxi. His reaction?
I'm really kind of befuddled. I'm not understanding why, if the U.S. government, because this is the U.S. Air Force Base, is importing marijuana. They got all of it in the world. They seize it. They want marijuana. Why do they need to bring it in?
The DC-6 Toliver flew has an interesting past. It's registered to a dummy corporation called World Air Leasing in Miami. Eyewitness News has traced the company to Alberto Herrero. Sources say he owns one of the companies, paid more than $87,000 by the State Department to fly humanitarian aid to the Contras. At the same time, Toliver says he was making his Guns for Drugs flights. Toliver has given sworn statements to both congressional investigators and independent prosecutor Lawrence Walsh, who's looking into the Iran-Contra affair. Tomorrow, more on how Toliver got involved in Guns for Drugs flights, including his recruitment by DEA informant Barry Seal. With an I-Team report, Susan Candiotti, Channel 10 Eyewitness News. Tonight we're going to tell you more about Mike Toliver, a convicted drug smuggler who says he flew 2 Guns for Drugs missions to the Contras last year. Missions he was hired for, he says, by CIA-linked contacts, including DEA informant Barry Seal. Who are these people, and how did Mike Toliver get hooked up with them? Toliver's story goes like this. The feelers were put out 2 years ago when Toliver got a phone call from Barry Seal. Seal, one of DEA's most productive informant pilots, was murdered in February of 1986 by Colombian hitmen.
Everybody and his brother knew that Barry was working for the government. The CIA specifically.
Seal told Toliver he had a job for him.
I want you to go to Miami, stop over there, wait for a contact, and they'll tell you what to do. Interesting flying, working for the government.
Toliver follows the instructions and flies to Tegucigalpa, Honduras, where he meets contact Wayne Westover, another pilot who knew Barry Seal. Westover is now doing time in a Miami federal prison on an unrelated drug conspiracy charge.
It was my job simply to see that he got introduced.
Introduced at a local hotel to a Honduran liaison for the Contra supply operation. Later, he comes face-to-face with this man, veteran CIA operative Rafael Quintero, who lives in Miami. Eyewitness News has been unable to reach him.
This guy, Rafa, seemed like he was like the boss. Rafa said, don't worry, so we have the cooperation of the government.
In January of '86, Quintero sends for Toliver to meet with him in Ecuador. Quintero tells Toliver he's to work with a new contact, replacing Barry Seal. That contact is a man Toliver later identifies as Felix Rodriguez. Rodriguez, alias Max Gomez, another Cuban exile with CIA ties who has worked closely with Quintero. A few months later, Toliver gets his final instructions from Rodriguez.
Don't bring anything with you. Don't bring any maps. Don't bring identification.
In March '86, Toliver takes this DC-6 loaded with guns from Miami to Aguacate, Honduras, where he says he's not the only gun runner on the ground.
Sometimes it looked like LaGuardia.
He flies back 25 tons of marijuana, landing at Homestead Air Force Base. While DEA, Customs, and Homestead totally deny Toliver's claims, he is expected to tell his story to federal and congressional investigators in Washington next month. With an I-Team report, Susan Candiotti, Channel 10 Eyewitness News. This internal memo, written by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Feldman and obtained by Eyewitness News, is raising questions about the U.S. Attorney's approach to an investigation of a government-linked Contra supply network in South Florida, a network operating at a time when U.S. military aid to the rebels was illegal. The document, stamped sensitive, is dated May 14, 1986. Both U.S. Attorney Leon Kellner and congressional investigators say it is a revised version of the original. Despite its contents, chock full of information about secret arms shipments and an FBI request to take it before a grand jury, the concluding line in the revised version reads, quote, "It would be premature to take this matter to a grand jury." The document was sent to Washington 1 month after U.S. Attorney General Ed Meese met with U.S. Attorney Leon Kellner about the allegations, and around the same time Congress was about to vote on a $100 million aid package to the Contras. The report contains much of the same information we told you about in an I-Team report 2 months ago. March and June 1985 arms shipments from Fort Lauderdale International Airport to El Salvador and on to the Contras' southern front in Costa Rica. It names the same players we named, including a former Dade corrections officer, Bay of Pigs organization members Rene Cuervo and Felipe Vidal, among others. A federal public defender also working on the case says government-linked witnesses he knows the feds interviewed are conspicuously missing from the memo. People like Oliver North State Department liaison Robert Owen and Contra Army leader Adolfo Calero. The question is, why, if that same information was available to the U.S. Attorney's Office, was it left out?
I think that if you indeed left out all linkages to the administration, then the administration would have certainly a built-in deniability as to their involvement with the private network.
Leon Kellner continues to deny he was ever told by anyone to slow down his investigation, nor does he say he ever told anyone else to do so. However, congressional sources tell Eyewitness News, independent counsel Walsh has a sworn statement from an assistant U.S. attorney who overheard Kellner tell Feldman to slow down the case. In Miami, Susan Candiotti, Channel 10 Eyewitness News. Convicted drug smuggler George Morales, an international champion raceboat driver, never had an audience quite like this. And yet here he is, taking an oath before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, telling the world he helped the Contras run guns for drugs flights from South Florida to the Contras' southern front in Costa Rica, starting in 1983 through last year.
We're looking for airplanes, money, training, weapons, explosives, any type, any kind of help.
Morales says his Contra contacts were Adolfo Popo Chamorro in Miami, as well as Octaviano Cesar and Marcos Aguado. Both, he says, worked for the CIA. Morales testified he bought weapons at a Miami gun shop and provided the Contras planes, including one documented in this registration paper we showed you in our February I-Team report.
What was in it for you? Why'd you give away these planes?
They promised me that they will take care of the legal activities.
At this point in time, did you make some agreement about running guns down to various locations and bringing drugs back?
Yes, I did. Also buying guns for them, supply safety houses for them in South Florida.
Where was the money coming from?
Drugs.
Morales told the panel he hired about 30 pilots to run Contra flights from Opa-locka and 2 Fort Lauderdale airports, often loading and unloading in broad daylight.
This whole crazy kind of at any cost keep the Contras alive philosophy, which we've seen demonstrated in the other set of hearings, permitted this kind of nefarious enterprise to flourish.
Morales is currently in contempt of a Miami federal grand jury for refusing to testify. He and his lawyers say U.S. Attorney Leon Kellner didn't want to hear his Contra claims a year ago because of political pressure, and that Kellner won't let DEA and Customs interview him now. The U.S. Attorney has not returned our repeated phone calls. Meantime, a Senate and 2 House committees are moving ahead with their investigations, adding they have many more witnesses to call. Susan Candiotti, Channel 10 Eyewitness News. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Feldman, represented by his father-in-law, Miami Attorney David Goodhart, returned to the House Judiciary Committee, intending to testify in public. Last week, he refused to talk to the panel until they let him do so in the open. However, the panel didn't change its mind.
As I move that the testimony be taken in executive session.
South Florida Congressman Larry Smith moved to close the hearing, and the panel promptly agreed, overruling objections from Feldman's attorney. Feldman has already been subpoenaed by other congressional committees, as well as the independent counsel, all looking into obstruction of justice charges involving a South Florida criminal investigation into the Contra supply network. The controversy surrounding Feldman's investigation, codenamed Costa 1, involves this May 1986 revised memo calling a grand jury probe premature. According to sources, the original version contained information that Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, his assistant Rob Owen, and American rancher John Hull were involved in the Contra supply network. The revised memo, written shortly after a visit by U.S. Attorney General Ed Meese with Feldman's boss Leon Kellner in Miami, left out that information. Kellner and Feldman deny there was any pressure from higher up to slow down or cover up their investigation.
I personally have not received any kind of word from anyone to slow the case down. If anything, I was given encouragement.
Despite more than 5 hours of testimony, the House Judiciary Committee might not be through with Feldman. His subpoena is open-ended. Meantime, after a year and a half, the Miami-based investigation into illegal Contra shipments has yet to hand down its first indictment. In Washington, Susan Candiotti, Channel 10 Eyewitness News on the Night Beat.
I asked him if he had made a decision on taking the case to a grand jury, and he advised me that he had not, that he wanted me, quote, to sit on the case until he got back from Washington. He thought politics were involved. I asked him, I thought you said politics were not a factor in this investigation. He says, for me, they're a factor. For you, they're not.
However, Feldman says that politics remark only pertained to a 3-day period when Kellner made a trip to Washington last August. He admits it still doesn't explain an additional 3-month delay before Kellner issued the final go-ahead for a grand jury investigation in November, ironically right after the Hassenfuss crash in Nicaragua. Feldman says he told the same story to House subcommittee investigators looking into obstruction of justice charges last summer involving U.S. Attorney General Ed Meese and U.S. Attorney Leon Kellner. Also at issue, this May 1986 memo, originally authored by Feldman, which calls a grand jury investigation into illegal Contra arms shipments premature. Feldman says that he wanted a grand jury investigation then, but that the memo was rewritten and sent to Washington without his knowledge. That stunned him, he says, but not as much as additional delays. The red flag didn't go up until 3 months later, when Kellner told him to sit on the case. He won't say whether he thinks Kellner was under political pressure or just being thorough.
Yes, I wanted to go to the grand jury more quickly than what I did, but I cannot tell you why the delay occurred. That's the bottom line.
But Mr. Kellner isn't making himself available to Eyewitness News to answer those questions. Informed sources also tell Eyewitness News the Miami FBI office has sent a memo to Washington critical of the U.S. Attorney's handling of the investigation. Incidentally, Mr. Feldman is leaving the U.S. Attorney's office in January. In Miami, Susan Candiotti, Channel 10 Eyewitness News on the Night Beat. Witnesses who claim they knew all about secret Miami arms shipments to the Contras. The memo said Feldman is out to make this investigation his career, that he has the big picture and isn't just looking at Neutrality Act violations. That Feldman has shown a top U.S. official a diagram with North's name on top, Owen underneath, and John Hull below. Hull is an American rancher whose Costa Rican farm was allegedly used to accept Contra supplies. Owen's memo also tells North the tide has turned. However, the Miami U.S. Attorney's Office, in a revised memo written 1 month later, does not mention Rob Owen at all, despite extensive interviews with mercenary Peter Glibbery and others who detailed their knowledge of Owen's alleged role in the Contra supply network. It will be a busy week for the Senate Select Committee. Not only is Rob Owen's testimony expected to put the Miami U.S. Attorney in an unfavorable light, Contra leader Adolfo Calero is expected to testify about his financial dealings with Oliver North and whether they violated the Boland Amendment. In Miami, Susan Candiotti, Channel 10 Eyewitness News. Former NSC consultant Rob Owen told the panel he was in Costa Rica last spring when he learned that federal investigators from Miami were also there looking into 2 illegal Contra supply flights from Fort Lauderdale. Owen says he was tipped off by U.S. Embassy officials in Costa Rica and American rancher John Hull. Owen then shot off this memo dated April of last year to alert his boss, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, shown as codename William. Owen says he had no ties to the Fort Lauderdale flights, but adds he is a subject of a Miami grand jury investigation into them. Owen's warning to North may have worked. A Miami federal grand jury investigation into the Fort Lauderdale flights didn't begin until at least 6 months after his memo was written. Owen also testified he once rode on a Southern Air transport plane accompanying supplies to the Contras. At another point, he chastised the State Department for using a plane recommended by the CIA that was once suspected of carrying drugs and using a crew with a criminal past.
In my mind, it was stupidity to use a plane that at one time had been used, or at least targeted as having been used, to carry drugs. And also, it was stupidity to use people who had a criminal record.
In Miami, Susan Candiotti, Channel 10 Eyewitness News on the Night Beat. The House Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime wants to hear from 3 Miami federal prosecutors about allegations that top Justice Department officials and possibly the White House pressured Miami U.S. Attorney Leon Kellner to back off Contra gun running and drug smuggling investigations.
There's no question that they're impeding our investigation. That is the Subcommittee on Crime of the Judiciary Committee. And we're investigating the allegations that they attempted to slow down or impede U.S. Attorney Kellner's investigation of the original criminal charges.
We first told you about those charges in an I-Team report last February called Guns for Drugs. Congressman Smith has seen that series. His subpoenas in part stem from an FBI probe and our investigation into 2 1985 arms shipments from Fort Lauderdale Airport to the Contra's southern front. Last year, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Feldman wrote a memo suggesting a grand jury be convened to look into it. Meantime, an aide to Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, Rob Owen, found out about the Miami investigation and wrote this coded memo to North warning him. At the time, North was heading secret Contra supply operations. A few weeks later, after Attorney General Ed Meese met with U.S. Attorney Leon Kellner in Miami, Feldman wrote this revised memo calling a grand jury investigation premature. Was there obstruction of justice? Both Meese and Kellner flatly deny there was any pressure to stop or slow the FBI probe. Kellner and 3 of his prosecutors have already given depositions to the Iran-Contra Select Committees. When we asked him about it 3 weeks ago, this is how he reacted.
It's not a general.
Can you give us the name of your lawyer?
I have no comment.
Can you give us the name of your lawyer for him to comment? Thank you.
The House subcommittee has also subpoenaed convicted drug smuggler George Morales. We also told you about him in our I-Team report. Morales is expected to say, among other things, he gave the Contras money, pilots, and planes in return for promises of help from the Justice Department. Now the question is, will the Attorney General try to block the House subcommittee subpoenas? Based on previous behavior, one congressman tells us he wouldn't be surprised. With an I-Team report, Susan Candiotti, Channel 10 Eyewitness News.